Welcome back, all of you. It's a pleasure to reconnect and continue with our event. We now have a panel who's moderated by Monica Sus, Professor Sus, and with a great set of panelists. And what we want to do now is to have a discussion around, or a conversation around, towards achieving a joint European security and defense. This panel will go till 3 o'clock, 2:55, and we'll then have the closing keynote by High Representative and Vice President Josep Borrell. However, before that, we have the panel. The panel is going to be masterfully moderated by Monica Sus. Monica Sus is a professor at the Hertie School. She's been there since 2015. She leads the Dahrendorf Foresight Project. She's also has had a position at the European University Institute in Florence, and she is very well suited to guide us in this panel. So, Monica, thank you very much for your time. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Angel, for this very kind introduction. Just let me briefly mention that I am a professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences and only a fellow at the Hertie School, so not to expect too much, maybe. But indeed, I am very pleased to moderate the panel, and I would just like to start with a few words of summary, maybe, of what we have discussed so far during the event. So we started this morning with a reflection on the key priorities for Europe as the geopolitical player. We talked about the relations with US and China, and also Rosa Balfour gave us a very excellent overview of the trends like authoritarianism that are also challenging the European Union right now. And then we moved on in the previous panel to the security challenges that the EU will be confronted with over the next few years, and to the discussion of EU's interests and capabilities in shaping the global governance. Now with this panel, we want to take the debate further and talk about whether the EU is actually well equipped and willing to be an impactful global player, and what must be done to improve EU's ability to act in the area of security and defense. And of course, some problems with the joint European security and defense have been known to us for years, such as, for example, the tedious and slow decision-making process, or the constant need for the better coordination between the member states. And at the same time, the last decade, and we heard a lot about that in the previous panel, has been full of strategic surprises, and the EU security environment has deteriorated significantly. In reaction to that, the EU introduced a range of new projects. Some of them have been also mentioned previously and today. And I mean here, for example, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, or the Coordinated Annual Review on Defense CARD, or the European Defense Fund launched by the European Commission. And experts describe this recent progress actually as the most far-reaching and unprecedented since the creation of CFSP. And yet, and we are here to discuss, we are still at the beginning of the road to a joint European security and defense. And I think it was Rosa Balfour who talked today about EU sharpening its toolbox, right, of these instruments. But she also indicated that the picture is still very misty. And against this backdrop, our discussion for the next almost 1.5 hours will seek to identify what is missing for effective and joint action in EU security and defense. We'll also reflect on the recent security and defense initiatives that I have just mentioned. And if time permits, we also come back to the question of COVID and the pandemic. Previous panel touched upon that, but if we have time, I would like to very much focus on the repercussions of the pandemic for especially the EU security over the next few years. And now it is my great honor and a great pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished guests that will share with us their thoughts on the topic of the panel. We have with us today 5 speakers, and I will start in alphabetical order, if you allow me to, with Dr. Bastian Giegerich. He is Director of Defense Military Analysis at the International Institute of Security Studies. Welcome. And then we have from Paris, Dr. Jean-Pierre Maulny. Deputy Director of the French Institute for International and Strategic Studies, as I said, in Paris. Warmly welcome also to you. I also would like to very much welcome Dr. Hanna Ojanen, Senior Research Fellow at the Faculty of Management and Business at Tampere University in Helsinki. We also have with us today Dr. Kolja Raube, Professor for European Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Catholic University Louvain and Research Manager at the Louvain Center for Global Governance Studies. And last but not least, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Dr. Ramses Wessel, Professor of European Law and Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And to kick off the debate, we will start with some opening statements from each panelist on the leading question of the panel. That is, let me put it out there for once again, what is missing for effective and joint action in common security and defense? And I invite all of you to reflect your particular area of expertise while answering this question. I think that will provide us with a broad picture of challenges and probably also some solutions that we can actually find during our conversation today. And so let me start with Bastian, who I believe could perhaps give some special consideration while answering this question to the differences in strategic cultures. The topic of political will of the member states has been brought up in the previous panel, and I think it links very nicely with the different strategic cultures. So Bastian, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Monica, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to participate in this kickoff conference of the Engage project. As some of you might know, the IISS has just recently opened its IISS Europe office in Berlin. So timing is very good for many reasons. And as Monica just said, in the session we're looking at the obstacles or the missing elements on a path. Or on the path towards a properly joined European security and defense policy. So I was asked to say a few words about the different strategic positions of member states in the EU and the resulting problems of coordination within the CSDP. We can probably in the discussion go back to specifics. Some of them have come up, I think, already in the last panel, and we might want to go back to some of those. But I think it's interesting that Javier Solana said this morning, action at the end of the day is what matters. And he also said that ultimately that action is a question of political will, and that generating that political will in a union that is large and diverse is of course a challenge. And I think it is interesting to just take a moment to remember that to me at least, the central promise of the EU as a security actor has actually remained largely the same for the last 30 years or so. Namely, firstly, to be a forum, an organization that can theoretically bring to bear political, diplomatic, development, economic, as well as civilian and military crisis management tools on a problem. Its potential offer, therefore, is more comprehensive than that of almost any other organization. And second, that by collaborating in the EU framework, member states should be able to lower the transaction costs of working together on security and defense issues, and might on occasion even reap efficiency gains and economies of scale. That has been the promise since the 1990s at the very least. The central problem of the EU as a security actor has also remained remarkably constant, and Monica has already alluded to that. The gap between the expectations created by rhetoric and by the spoken word, and the EU's actual military, for example, ability remains rather significant. And of course, and this leads us to the subject here, EU institutions can only hope to achieve effect in security and defense terms if member states provide effective capabilities, and if member states have a shared political agenda to deploy resources for common objectives. That's the action, I think, that Javier Solana was alluding to at the beginning of this conference. And because national security policies actually remain driven by fairly distinct national priorities, that is a problem. And we heard already some of that in the first panel. So overall, even at the beginning of the third decade of CSDP and on the verge of the fourth decade of CFSP, the first issue we still have to acknowledge are these persistently divergent perceptions, threat perception, and strategic priorities across Europe. And I think, and maybe we can come back to this, Monica, in the discussion or in the next round. Processes like the strategic compass, and you've mentioned others, show this actually, where we have, even though not published, a shared threat analysis, but not a shared threat assessment. Why does this matter? Well, to me, the difference is in an analysis, everybody can agree that, for example, international terrorism is a threat that needs to be recognized, the different permutations that it might take today, and so on and so forth. In an assessment, one would also want to include how important is this threat in relation to other threats? What resources should be made available to fight it, to mitigate its effects, to improve resilience? And my proposition for discussion really would be that doing an assessment would bring out the differences quite quickly, and hence we are attempting an analysis and not an assessment. Because in an analysis, one can raise awareness, one can look for consensus, but one does not need to prioritize. But, you know, to go back to what Javier Solana said, without priorities, my interpretation now, it is hard to see how that action can come about. So while the promise and the problem have stayed the same, what has changed radically is, of course, the international context in which the EU operates and which its aspirations that we're analyzing and that we're hoping to add something to need to correspond. As I might have said before, to me, the relevant comparison is not whether we're moving faster than we used to move. The relevant comparison is, are we moving fast enough to keep up with the change around us? It's not about our own speed compared to our own speed a moment ago. It is about our speed in relation to the environment around us. So while the mid to late 1990s provided the inspiration for the EU's civilian and military crisis management efforts, today the EU and its member states must chart a path that protects the foundations of their prosperity, of their security, I would say in an era of great power competition that could lead to military conflict. And at the same time, challenges to security in Europe and Europe's southern and eastern periphery remain plentiful and very real. So the threat vectors range from stability risks such as regional conflicts or international terrorism with primary indirect and perhaps non-existential impact to systemic conflict and armed aggression with direct and potentially existential effects on European security. And the problem is that these things happen simultaneously, and that people have very different reactions to them. And I'm going to close, hopefully, just inside of my 7.5 minutes, with that one of the questions we might want to debate is whether or not this change in the international context, in tandem with the evolution of the EU security and defense role and the institutional setup and the new initiatives. So these two, from a national perspective, external adaptation pressures, whether they actually create greater overlap of national positions from a European strategic culture position, often called for, still absent, can it arise from that evolution? I personally have my doubts, but I'd be interested in the perspective of others. So I'll stop here for now, and maybe we can come back to some of these later on, Monica. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bastian. We'll definitely come back to the question of the strategic compass and also to the, let's say, expectations gap that still exists, or it's even actually growing in the realm of, security environment that is, as you said, totally different as it used to be 10 years ago. So yeah, we will definitely come back to that. But for now, let's hear Jean-Pierre's perspective on this topic of the panel. And since Jean-Pierre, you're one of your many areas of expertise is. And actually, the defense industry question has been also raised in the previous panel with the expectation that with this panel will provide some more information on that. I would invite you to reflect on this particular issue while answering the question of this panel. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Monica, and it's a real pleasure to participate to this kickoff conference of the Engage program. So the question of the role of defense industry in the CSDP refers to the question of the strategic cultures of the member states. If I take the example of my country, France, the arms industry was developed in the late 1950s in order to strengthen our sovereignty. So this defense industry was the heart of the French strategic autonomy. And so in France, the concept of strategic autonomy was therefore not born until 2013, but the concept was used for the first time. It was born in France 60 years ago. But all the EU countries do not have the same strategic culture. All countries do not have the same defense industrial capabilities, and it's normal. The question is, if we want to build an European defense industrial capability, this should not be the lowest common denominator. On this subject, the European Commission developed an ambitious vision of what the EDTIB should be. If you take the communication of July 2013 of the European Commission towards a more competitive and efficient defense industry, defense and security sector, it was written in this communication. I cite the communication. At the same time, the importance of this industry cannot be measured only in jobs and turnover. The EDTIB constitutes a key element of Europe's capacity to ensure the security of its citizens and to protect its values and interests. Europe must be able to assume its responsibilities for its own security and for international peace and stability in general. This necessitates a certain degree of strategic autonomy to be a credible and reliable partner. Europe must be able to decide and to act without depending on the capabilities of third parties. Security of supplies, access to critical technologies and operational sovereignty are therefore crucial. Since 2016, there was this debate on the strategic autonomic concept. The point of view were different, but the question was sometimes badly posed by the strategic autonomy being for some perceived as a form of taking off independence vis-à-vis the United States, which is not the question. If you take recently the action plan of synergies between civil and defense space industry, published in February by the European Commission, I think this action plan asks the question from a more appropriate angle by deciding to develop technology roadmaps to boost innovation and critical technologies for the defense space and related civil sectors. I think this is right, as the real question is indeed those of the European overall competitiveness of the European high-tech industry. Knowing that high technology are today dual-use technologies and not specifically military technologies. We must therefore develop these technologies of the future if the European Union wants to strengthen its competitiveness. We must also free ourselves from technological dependencies, which would hamper this competitiveness, and we must finally ensure an appropriate level of security of supply at the European level, specifically on military products. So this technological challenge, which is larger than the question of the EDTIB, is the first challenge for the EU. The second is a challenge of industrial consolidation. As you know, this industry is regulated by the states, but the investors are mainly private ones. So economic competitiveness plays a very important role for these investors, knowing that the economic competitiveness is determined both by the technological performance of the products manufactured, but also by the cost of the products. If you take a look to the landscape of the arms industry today, we see that we have no consolidation in European Union since the end of the 1990s. But if you take a look in the landscape in the US today, we see that there is a second step of industrial consolidation, knowing that the first step was after the Cold War. And so the second step has begun in the US with, for example, the recent mergers of United Technologies and with Raytheon, Northrop Grumman with Orbital ATK, and Lockheed Martin acquisition of Sikorsky. These mergers are simply the prelude to a more widespread wave of mergers in the United States, similar to what was seen at the end of the Cold War. In Europe, we need to carry out the same industrial consolidation if we want to sustain the competitiveness of the EDTIB. So to do this, we need more cooperation on armaments. This cooperation in the field of armaments should make it possible to have better interoperability of equipment, of course, but it should also allow us to bring together the interests of companies and therefore to favor industrial consolidations. So if we see the European Defence Fund today, it should enable us to favor this industrial consolidation thanks to two key rules in the EDF. The first rule is that it is necessary to build consortium with 3 companies from 3 different countries to have access to the fund of the European Defence Fund. So this rule should make it possible to develop cooperation in the field of armaments, and so consequently to induce industrial consolidation in the defense sector. The second rule is says that one of the award criteria to get access to the fund is to involve SMEs and mid-caps located in countries which do not have the most important industry in the projects, so by opening the defense supply chain, which are more or less closed today. We can therefore hope that the European Defence Fund resolve the conflict of interest that may exist, and it is the question you ask, the conflict of interest that may exist between the countries which have the most important DTIBs and those which have less important DTIBs by creating an interest in cooperating of common projects, and so involving everyone. So industrial consolidation and involvement of the whole national DTIB in future cooperative programs are the key objectives to reach with the EDF in the future. So I stop for the moment. I think we have questions to perhaps to develop on the coordination between the initiative and the question of the European Defence Fund. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, definitely. I noted a couple of notions that I would like to pick your brain later in the debate, such as autonomous action, but also the industrial consolidation that you referred to a lot. And I think this is indeed one of the crucial areas. But for now, let me move on to Hanna and to another dimension of joint action in CSDP. But there is still an important link, I think, that kind of relates the defense industry and the topic that Hanna will talk about, and I mean here the United States. I would like to invite you, Hanna, to of course, again, answer the guiding question of the panel, but also to focus more on the relations between NATO and US and the EU, especially topical issue, of course, given yesterday's EU-US summit in Brussels and in general Biden's visit to Europe. And this is also one of the topics you worked on extensively, Hanna. So could you share with us your thoughts on that? Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monica. Really glad to be here from Tampere. And the question of what is missing, that is really a pertinent one. After all, we do have quite a lot. We have plenty of ideas, we have initiatives, we have concepts, we have capabilities. We are to have a compass. So I think what we are missing is the spelling out or an up-to-date expression for what the EU is in security and defense today. We know that it plays an increasing role in the defense policies of its member states. It plays an increasing role for NATO, but we might not have clear ways of expressing what that role is and what the EU's impact actually is in this field. And this is for a reason, because we know that the EU didn't play any role in defense for a long time. It wasn't originally thought to take care of these questions. It wasn't needed for that. There were other organizations, other actors that were fully sufficient. Now, the situation is different. The EU is involved in defense, and I'm arguing here, I guess, that the EU is needed in defense. And many actors start to recognize that. Yet, its role, its relation to defense is very different from that of the states, of NATO, or of other organizations, because the EU itself is different. And if we think about defense in the EU, we also see a very odd combination of different aspects that stem from different periods in history that do not make a coherent whole. We have a 1940s type of mutual defense clause that doesn't have any sign of common institutions. We have a 1990s type of battle group concept for crisis management without any sign of common funds. Then we have a 2001 type of solidarity clause which hints at a variety of security needs and interdependence. And now we have a defense fund that is a hint at supranationalism. And here we come to the specific feature, of course, and that is supranationalism. The EU is the only supranational actor in the field of security and defense, the only one that has supranational decision-making in the Commission, in the Parliament, over some common funds. And even without formal competencies, it does regulate to some extent over defense questions through internal market regulation or as questions of industrial policy or trade. And I think one way of understanding this development and these differences is exactly to look at the interaction between the EU and NATO. That are completely different organizations in a sense that originally didn't have anything to do with each other, were kept separate, but now do work together. And one could say that NATO has been the most important external variable in the development of EU defense. It has been a model in many ways, not least for the military structures in the EU, but it has also been one to try to limit the development of the EU. And in the background, obviously, we have the views of the United States that also have been different in different periods of history. Now, these limitations are interesting. Early on, one stressed the idea that the EU would not have own planning and conduct capability, but would rely on NATO, thereby essentially working for NATO. There was a hierarchy between the two. The primacy of NATO is something that we see expressed even in the Lisbon Treaty, in the Mutual Defence Clause that speaks about NATO members seeing their defence obligations as primarily linked to NATO. Only primarily, one might add today. But what is also frequently cited is the principle of complementarity and avoiding duplication, or a division of labor and specialization between these two organizations. Again, this might be rational, but from the point of view of an organization, these two are limitations. When an organization finds its tasks being limited, it becomes less flexible. It becomes less useful or less relevant in tackling new challenges in changing circumstances. This is why division of labor is actually avoided. And when we think about the EU and everything we know about the process of integration, we might think that it would be antithetical to the very idea of integration itself to limit the spillover and say integration cannot reach any one particular field. So one reason why, despite all these limitations and competition, the EU has evolved towards defense might be that might have to do with coherence, might have to do with links between different fields, and we also see the need for autonomy. Now we see a military planning and conduct capability in place. The discussions on strategic autonomy are very much about the needs, about the EU's needs to be able to make its own analysis, set its own goals, choose its own means. And when we combine these, have its own strategy, where cooperation certainly is an essential part. So there is developments, and I think NATO, for one, sees now the usefulness of all these developments. NATO has been calling the EU an essential and strategic partner for quite some time already. The partnership has in recent years developed through a range of practical cooperative projects, from resilience to hybrid threats to military mobility, to plenty of other projects still. And on Monday in the NATO summit communique, the NATO again called the EU a unique and essential partner, and NATO stressed the importance of a stronger and more capable European defense. So could we actually say that we are now in a situation where the defense of Europe is not possible without the EU? One concrete example where this might be the case is military mobility, which is very important for NATO's defense planning, but where we see that not much really moves without the EU being there for legislation, for funds needed, and so on. Similarly, there is more and more need for the EU as security threats diversify, as they are getting more hybrid. So in sum, I think what is missing is an understanding of the EU as a different but necessary player in European defense. NATO seems to get this. The member states might still be struggling with the concept. And here is where I end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hanna. If I may, I will definitely would like to hear more on the military mobility, but let's do this in the second round, okay? But this is something where I think we indeed may see some tangible cooperation between EU and NATO, and recently also with the invitation to the United States to participate in the PESCO project on military mobility. But for now, I would like to give the floor to Kolja and to ask you, Kolja, to elaborate a bit more on the institutional aspects of CSDP and in general of the cooperation in security and defense. We heard a lot about the instruments so far, and I think also in the previous panel, institutions has been identified as crucial for effectiveness and for the enhancement of, let's say, capacity of the EU in this area. So without further ado, the floor goes to you, Kolja. Thanks.
And thank you very much for having me on this panel. Thank you very much to the organizers. Thank you, Monica, for chairing, and the colleagues for this very interesting discussion that we have. You mentioned the instruments and also how important the actors are. And I will start by basically saying that the two are actually interlinked. And I would like to basically take you a little bit back to the Lisbon Treaty just for a second, because probably Ramses will say more about this as well. But you know, the Lisbon Treaty was very clear that there should be a new, so to speak, a new body, institution, coming in, depending on whether you're a legal scholar or political science scholar, we can debate about what that is, but the High Representative Vice President was coming in, right? So the HRVP was reformed and was there to bring in more coherence, to bring more coherence to the field of foreign policy, but also to the field of security. And the External Action Service, the European External Action Service, was supposed to help the new body to achieve this, both horizontal, institutional, but also vertical coherence mattered. Now, what we saw was also that actually there was quite a lot of, Bastian mentioned it, talk about this also in the policy planning. We heard about comprehensive approaches over the last couple of years. We heard about integrated approaches to defense over a couple of years. And finally, we're talking about joined up action. So that has always been an issue, I would argue, of coherence. How do you bring the different instruments together? And actors play a role here. But what is new, I think, basically what is new is also this notion of comprehensiveness, of actually looking into nexuses, which policy fields are interlinked: security and development, security and migration, and we could name many other. Melton mentioned in the environment earlier on in our debates, and probably now we are talking about health these days. So there are lots of nexuses that pop up, and we see that in a lot of these nexuses, CSDP and the intergovernmental set of actors is no longer the only set of actors responsible for security when you link it to other policy fields. So when you talk about other policies, you talk about other actors, and that's where the Commission is coming in, and that's where also the European Parliament is coming in, I would argue. How can I argue this? And why does that lead to complexity? Well, we can only, for example, look into the field of development and also the wider spectrum of instruments which are around there. And we immediately look at the MFF, and we look at external financial instruments in the MFF, both 2014-2020, but also the new big global instrument created now for the next couple of years. And we see that there is actually a lot of security in there, in these instruments. We can name in the period of 2014-2020 the Instrument for Stability and Peace. We can, of course, also look at the Development Cooperation Instrument, the previous one, and look then how, so to speak, security aspects have been weaved into this. But we can also look at the new NDICI, the Neighborhood Development International Cooperation Instrument, and look how much basically money has been reserved that goes directly into the field of security I did the calculation earlier this morning, and I think of these 80 billion euros and the MFF, some almost 12 billion euros go into areas related to security. Now, we can argue about this, but what it brings to the table is actually a different set of actors. The European Commission, obviously, but also the European Parliament, which is not only in the game when it talks about the budget, but also when it comes to reviewing the MFF after a period of time. So my argument is basically that we see an increasingly complex set of actors in security once we are not looking exclusively at CSDP. But also when we are not looking into the MFF, we should, of course, one issue I forgot is, of course, that in the MFF, we have the research and development part, right, which contributes now to the European Defense Fund. And that is, of course, very important. So we see there as well on the internal side of the MFF, security and defense popping up. Another issue which I think is important to be understood is that we have the other EDF, the European Development Fund, and also in the European Development Fund, of course, we have security. Yeah, we can look at the African Peace Facility, and we will see that there as well an additional dimension comes in. Of course, the European Parliament is not as heavily involved in the European Development Fund as it would like to be, but certainly the European Commission is in there as well. Now, that brings me to one, so to speak, overarching, so to speak, comment, and that is that I think over the last couple of years, we have not only seen more actors willingly coming into the field, but also I would say perhaps strategically, the field has opened up for these actors. When the intergovernmental, so to speak, CSDP was blocked, there was a supranational way out, right? You could basically say, well, then we use the MFF, then we use the European Defense Fund as a new tool to speed up actually the European Defense Union, and the Juncker Commission was very happy doing that. And I think that is something that we should also have a good look at when we are talking about this field. One important thing is once you push, I think, security into this, so to speak, nexus domain, then you get to institutional complexities. And these institutional complexities, a lot of people would argue, are harmful to security because you lose efficiency and effectiveness. Yeah, you cannot actually do it quickly, rapidly. It's just no longer possible because you basically have to do the Brussels game. You are in basically the institutional complexity of the different institutions. At the same time, from a European Parliament perspective, and I guess the European Commission is also more or less leaning towards that perspective, you would say, well, you bring more legitimacy to security, right? It doesn't necessarily remain an exclusive issue of the governments of the European Union. It becomes actually something that is much closer to the citizens of Europe and that is more responsive to their needs and to what they would like to have as being looked at as European security. So there is this legitimacy argument coming from the European Parliament. However, I think one last issue is very important here, and that is how do you actually bring these two together? Yeah, how can you consolidate the effectiveness and how can you consolidate, so to speak, the legitimacy logic? And I think it needs a way of rethinking European security also along these lines, because as we know, European politics, and the first panel has talked a lot about that, and their response to international security is no longer something that is going unpoliticized. The issues are increasingly politicized, and they are actually increasingly issues that are debated on the level of the member states, on citizens' levels. Parties bring it up, and so there needs to be, I would argue, some sort of a bringing together of these two logics, the efficiency logic and the legitimacy logic, if you want to respond to the fact that European security also becomes increasingly politicized. So I will stop here, Monica.
Thank you so much, Kolja. This is indeed really interesting also, especially because you brought up the European Parliament into the debate. And I think this is an institution that has been for a long time quite undervalued with regards to its role in security and defense and foreign policy. So this is really important, I think. And now moving on to Ramses, and I think that it fits actually quite nicely, since Kolja mentioned the dilemma between effectiveness and legitimacy, and also the institutional complexity as a challenge for moving forward with security and defense in a joint mode. So maybe there are some legal aspects that, Ramses, you could elaborate on that actually can help us, to move on with the joint action. And I think someone from the previous panel mentioned that maybe it's enough to implement the instruments that the Treaty of Lisbon is actually offering us. So I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that, and of course also on the guiding question of the panel. Over to you, Ramses.
Thank you so much indeed, Monica. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, indeed, there are always legal aspects to anything. That is the fun part of my job. And I think it's also part of my job here, not only in the panel today, but also perhaps in Engage at large, to keep a keen eye on what the treaty actually tells us. And I have to admit that sometimes we have to go back to the treaty and see what it actually tells us, what the intentions of the member states are. And that's exactly what I want to do. So I will also try and share some text with you, if you allow me, because it's, for lawyers, almost impossible to share their ideas without showing the actual text that is underlying everything that we do. So it's indeed a bit about legal challenges, and don't worry, Monica, I will stay within my 7 minutes with my 7 slides. So let's take a look at that. I mean, one of the very first things I would like to stress is going back to the original idea of this, as these were, of course, and it may sound like obvious to everyone, but of course it were the states themselves that came up with the idea, right? It's not so much the European Union that is forcing something upon the states. No, this is what the state representatives wrote down when they drafted the treaty in the beginning, in the preamble. They were resolved to implement a common foreign and security policy, which includes a progressive framing of a common defense policy. You can see that here, with all kinds of objectives attached to it. So this was the origin of it. So they themselves, the state representatives, came up with this idea. But then the interesting question comes after that, and that is, in fact, that they allow the union to take care of this. Throughout the day, we have heard a couple of times that the union does not have any competences in the area of CFSP or CSDP. According to the treaty, that is not correct. In fact, it's perhaps interesting to underline that the whole thing is a union competence. And you can see many references in the treaty to the fact that both CFSP and CSDP are in fact in the hands of the union and not the member states. The union's competence in matters of foreign and security policy covers all areas of foreign policy, etc. The union shall conduct, define, and implement, etc., etc. So of course there is a role of the member states, but in the end, the competence as such is a union competence, and it's essential to understand that key aspect, I think, of CFSP and CSDP. And as you can see finally on this slide, CSDP, of course, is a part of CFSP. And going back to the treaty again, you can see that it is a sort of subsection of the chapter on CFSP. And for lawyers, these things are important because they imply that the rules that we have on CFSP are also valid in principle for everything we do in the area of CSDP. So this sort of defines the framework. And then in that sense, it's interesting also to be the last speaker, because this is what usually also happens, of course, in Brussels. You have all kinds of political ideas and objectives. And then at the end, the legal service is asked for advice. Can we actually do this? It's not the other way around. It hardly starts at the legal service. The legal service normally comes at the end. So in that sense, well done in the format of this conference. So let me also underline a few things here, which relates to exactly the competences. Because if we are talking about CFSP and CSDP being a union competence, of course, the next question that any legal scholar would ask, what kind of competence is it? Is it an exclusive competence? Is it a shared competence? Is it something else? And then it's interesting to see that the treaty doesn't give an answer to that. CFSP is not listed among the exclusive competences or among the shared competences. It simply says something like, we have exclusive competences, these relate to trade and other things. We have shared competences like, for instance, environment. And we have this thing called CFSP. So it's mentioned separately. That is interesting to see. At the same time, there is a debate going on about this nature in legal doctrinal work these days. Because if you look, for instance, at the international agreements that are concluded in the area of CFSP and CSDP, it's very interesting to note that those international agreements are EU-only agreements, meaning that they're just signed by the European Union and not by the member states as well. So they're not mixed agreements, something which you would normally see if a competence is shared, for instance. So this sort of hints at exclusivity, but I think that we will all very soon agree that CFSP and CSDP are not exclusive competence for the European Union. No, the member states still have a lot to say there, but it's more complex than that. That is the point I wanted to make here. Then also perhaps on a sort of positive note, perhaps, because we have been quite pessimistic today, listening to some of the presentations, there was a hint of it's not going well or it's not going fast enough. We have expectations, we have this traditional gap between ambitions and what we see in practice. In the end, if you take a look over a longer period, there are some developments that are perhaps unexpected, but very, very relevant. First of all, institutional development, and Koya also hinted at that just a minute ago. The role of the European External Action Service, the role of the High Representative. And perhaps as honest brokers, we can discuss that, but at least as a sort of pivot between the different institutions, trying to bring not only the institutions, but also the member states and the institutions more closely together. We see the council in the composition of ministers of defense. This would have been unthinkable, let's say 15, 20 years ago, right? Having military people, even the chiefs of defense, meeting in the council buildings in Brussels. This is something that we've grown accustomed to these days, but let's face it, these are very, very interesting developments. An extensive role of the Political and Security Committee, taking the lead sometimes. The Council allows the PSC to take many, many decisions on implementation. And last but not least, the role of the Court of Justice, which has really taken up a role also in the area of CFSP and CSDP. Again, something that we would have not have thought of perhaps a number of years ago. Almost at the end, Monica. CFSP and CSDP, if you look at the treaty, you can see in this famous Article 24 in the Treaty on European Union that the Union's competence in matters of CFSP shall cover all areas of foreign policy and all questions relating to the Union security. All questions in all areas, that's quite a lot, right? And then, of course, the question is, did they actually make use of this competence to cover everything? And then we did a study about that with a group of people you can see at the bottom of this slide. And CFSP, it's mainly about sanctions. That's perhaps not a surprise. And in CSDP, it's mainly about establishing military missions, civilian and military missions. In CSDP, it's about 85% of the decisions are related to CSDP missions. So there's a clear focus in both in CFSP and in CSDP on what this broad competence of the Union has actually led to. So finally, then, where does that lead us? This everything, and then I come back also to something you mentioned, Monica, and that is, are there any things in the treaty that we can perhaps use or have underused, sometimes referred to as sleeping beauties that are in the treaty? And obviously, one of the discussions that is going on, and we had a brief engaged meeting last week about that, is the use of QMV in these areas. Is it possible at all? Yes, it is possible in CFSP. No, it's not so easy in CSDP because it's clearly singled out as not being possible in CSDP. So qualified majority is possible, but not for decisions having military or defense implications, as Article 31 tells us. So that is deliberately singled out when the treaty was drafted. And that also limits the possibilities, on the basis of the treaty at least, to include, for instance, civilian crisis management missions that were mentioned by the Juncker Commission as potential areas where QMV could perhaps be used. The von der Leyen Commission only mentioned human rights or sanctions implementation as possible areas to introduce QMV. But the Juncker Commission went one step further and said, perhaps civilian crisis management missions could also be included. I think the reason that it's left out in the more recent State of the Union is exactly that the treaty sits uneasy with that idea of introducing QMV in that area. The final point then, that may have been underused is differentiated integration. There are also all kinds of possibilities that are now used for the first time in PESCO, for instance, to allow smaller groups of member states to work together more closely. And by the way, establishing those smaller groups is possible by QMV. That is interesting, right? So we do not all have to agree with that idea. So that may offer options as well. A downside of that may very well be that we run the risk of what I call here bringing intergovernmentalism back in. And we seem to be moving slowly away from intergovernmentalism in CSDP, but stepping sort of outside of the treaty, creating other frameworks where only certain member states would cooperate will probably not contribute to any further integration, at least in the area of CSDP. That was my part. Monica, back to you.
Thank you so much, Ramses. This is really important. And I see we have some questions that came in, and I would like to move on to the questions very soon. But for now, there's one more question that I would like to ask Ramses, and I think this is the moment to do it, actually. And I would be really interested in your take whether qualified majority voting can actually, and I understand, of course, it's not possible in CSDP, but possible in CFSP. Can it, in your opinion, actually move us closer to, like, let's say, more efficiency and more rapid action to some extent? I mean, you mentioned the downsides, right? So what is your take on that? That will be my question to you, Ramses. And then we move on to the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a very good question indeed. And in the discussion, this is the one that needs to come up, right? So even if it is possible, and there are possibilities in the treaty, for instance, to use this famous passerelle clause where you allow the European Council to decide that something can be taken, a decision can be taken by qualified majority in the future. So the European Council can unanimously, obviously, decide that in the future, some decisions may be taken by qualified majority voting. So there are these possibilities. Then the question is, will this actually help? Right? So it may speed up certain processes, but even if it does speed up processes, what do you lose in terms of legitimacy? For instance, if a certain decision is not backed up by 27 anymore, but let's say by only 20 of the member states, will that actually make Europe stronger, or will it just lead to more divergence in that area? That is a political science question, I guess, so I cannot answer that one. But the possibilities are certainly there, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. We are moving now in the reverse order, as you can probably notice, and I will pose a question to Kolja, and this is a question that is actually a combined question of myself and of one of the participants, Owen Scott. And the question, Kolja, to you precisely is that the participant is wondering whether what is your take on the issue that we have the strategy compass debate, right? And to what extent can strategy compass harm the EU relations with NATO? This is the question that the participant asks. And if I may add to this, like another layer of this question, I would say, what do you really make of the process of strategy compass? And I think I will also pose the question later to Bastian, since he also mentioned the process. And but let's now move on to Kolja.
Thank you very much. So if I understand it correctly, Monica, I will first answer the question on EU-NATO and then also focus a little bit on the strategic compass. While
yes, I mean, the question on EU-NATO goes actually in the direction of strategic compass. So whether the compass harmed the relations, right? Yeah.
No, I think, you know, there is one reading, of course, that you always hear and that has always been there, and that is a strong NATO needs a strong European Union. So as long as there is no duplication, I think there is rather the opposite true. If the European Union can develop instruments that are meaningful, that are useful to actually bring up its capability with regards to crisis management, but also with regards to defense, then this is an asset also for transatlantic relations and NATO. The European Union has a great advantage over NATO, and that is, and I alluded to that earlier and many others did as well, it has a wider set of instruments available compared to NATO. So in a way, the EU can do things that NATO will not be able to do. And it would, in that sense, be very important to actually focus also on that comprehensivity of the European Union as actually something that is complementary to what NATO does. So that's rather my answer to the question. I don't necessarily see it as actually harming EU-NATO relations. Rather, I'm seeing it as a tool to bring the European Union up to a level that it can actually contribute to NATO and the overall transatlantic relations. We will talk about the strategic compass, as you said, a little bit more in detail later, but one of the elements there in the compass is actually to think about capabilities, to bring up European capabilities. And I guess the crucial issue will be to think about how these capabilities can be used in alignment with developments at NATO. We obviously can talk about strategic autonomy. We can talk about how much the European Union needs to be prepared to do it alone. But I think that's another discussion that we will probably tap into.
Okay, so let me now pose the question to Bastian, if I may, on the strategic compass, not necessarily in the EU, NATO or EU-US relations, but I will be interested in your take on let's say, on the expected results from the strategic compass. So you mentioned, of course, the divergent threat perceptions and let's say also the capabilities expectations gap that is, of course, and has been there in the European security and defense. And I have to say, I am somehow afraid that the strategic compass can actually enlarge the gap if we really expect too much from it. But I will be interested in hearing your voice on that. So what do you make of this process and of the possible results?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. I mean, I suppose we'll have to see, but the point that is perhaps worth remembering is that the strategic compass is meant to complement the 2016 EU global strategy, and you will remember that was really never, that 2016 document was really never fully embraced by member state governments at the time. And I think that is why we see a somewhat different approach here in terms of, you know, early on a more of a bottom-up process of consensus building on threat pictures and so on and so forth, in order to perhaps enlarge that space then talk about the baskets of crisis management, resilience, capability development, and working with partners. So in a way, you know, that makes sense to me. Whether that will work is, of course, a different process, or sorry, a different question. I would caution against putting too much weight on a process like this. Really, the end result probably will be actually not the important bit. The important bit is now the process of generating it, because that is either where more consensus will emerge or not. What at the end gets written down is only codifying that agreement that either exists or doesn't. And I think if we look at what has become apparent so far, I think, you know, one needs to remain cautious. It is about making sure, so far, to my view at least, to make sure that everybody's views are reflected. You know, it's the inclusive angle is certainly something that is important in the beginning, but I think as you walk further through that funnel of this 2-year process, you will want to come to something that is a bit different, and I'm not sure whether that process will generate this. I spoke a little bit about the difference between threat analysis and threat assessment, and I think you know, that is at the core. Is that question: will that changing environment and the processes that we see evolve within the EU framework, will they lead gradually to more overlap? This process will only succeed if it is built on that broader overlap. If it tries to, as has been tried in the past, to put a European strategic culture in top down, it won't work. So I think there really is no other way than to try this, but it's going to be difficult. And if it diverges to you know, into another exercise where we will just claim that we have now defined a strategic culture, I think it'll be mostly pointless, frankly.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, of course, developing cultures, strategic cultures, is a long-term thing. So hopefully nobody will claim that. But I mean, we all know that the EU has a certain tradition in doing so, right? Okay, I have now one question from a panelist to Hanna. I will read it if you allow me. As this and the previous panel mentioned, strategic autonomy has become a buzzword within the EU circles. And yet yesterday's EU-US summit statement failed to mention it a single time. How can the panelists make sense of it? And is a signal of renewed European complacency, or is it a sign that US is still suspicious about the goal of strategic autonomy? I think, Hanna, you can take it, right? And then probably also I will rephrase the question and pose it to Jean-Pierre, since I think France and strategic autonomy is also very well laid off to answer this. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, this was actually very interesting to note. People were listening very carefully to what was being said and what words are being used, as there are these words that should come up in certain circumstances, and we notice that they don't come up. But actually, I wouldn't think this particular case matters so much. It was no doubt intentionally avoided because there has been a lot of debate and different interpretations about what it is, and one didn't want to go back to that. Leaving out is an easy way of avoiding that discussion. But it doesn't mean that the idea of strategic autonomy somehow disappeared or was not relevant. I think what has been recently the main point when people have been trying to explain the concept is that a certain degree of autonomy is necessary, but it doesn't mean that one doesn't cooperate. it actually facilitates cooperation quite a lot. When you are capable, you are more capable of cooperation as well, and you are somehow getting sort of more defined in what your capabilities actually are. So that would be my answer.
Okay, so you wouldn't read too much into the issue that it hasn't been mentioned by the US. Okay, good. Then we are moving on to Jean-Pierre, and I would like to give you a choice whether you answer the question on the strategic autonomy, or you would take up on my question that I would like to ask you. And actually, my question would be kind of connected with the strategic autonomy, but I would like to hear from you your take on the issue that, I mean, we all know that High Representative Borrell talks a lot about the EU learning to speak the language of power, right? And the initiatives that you also mentioned in your intervention, concretely the European Defence Fund, do they really, and of course CART and PESCO and so on, do they really bring us closer to the EU speaking the language of power? That would be my question to you, Jean-Pierre. So basically you are free to choose which question you would like more, or answer both.
Your second question is very philosophical. For the first question on strategic autonomy, I totally agree with Hanna on the question of cooperation. You know, it's very funny in France on the question of strategic autonomy, because I don't know if we launch the debate, but it's sure that it will take the French document, the strategic document, it is written around 20 or 25 times. It shows that it's really a French concept. But today in France, when you speak with the official on the question, they say, be careful, don't use the term strategic autonomy. It could be a problem at the EU level. So that's why, if you heard what I say, that specifically on the question of the technological question, I think we have to emphasize on simply the development of high technology at the level of the European Union, because it's a competitiveness of the EU. And we don't want to be less competitive than the US or the China. We want to be competitive. If we have technological competitive, we will have an EDTIB competitive, because we can't do anymore this link between all this sector. That's the first thing. The second thing is simply we define crisis management operations after the Balkan crisis in the headline goals, in the Helsinki headline goals. If we are not able to have these capabilities for these missions, it's a problem. Don't forget that the CSDP is born after the Balkan failures, and the Balkan failures, we have to call US to find the solution. I'm not sure that the US won't come anytime when you have a problem at the level of European Union. We have to take in account simply our problem. That's a strategic autonomy at the level of the military operation missions. And that's sure that if we develop capabilities, of course, we enforce also the NATO capabilities. The question of the power, I think, yes, it's a question, because it's also the question simply of the fact that today, European Union, it's an economic power, it's a cultural power, it's a normative power, you can say, but it's not a diplomatic and a defense power. And I think it's a problem. It's a problem. We have to have all the means of the power. For the defense questions, we don't use to have the same military power than the US, for example. It's not necessary. It's not our goal. But I think it's simply, if we want simply to keep this sort of global power, we have to emphasize this possibility to have a more diplomatic power and a more defense power. But it's sure that to do so, we want to think European Union has the power. And it's sure that if you take back to the question of the strategic culture, it's a sort of strategic culture for France, but not certainly for all the EU member states.
Okay, thank you so much. Now we have one question directly to Ramses from one of the participants, and the question is from the perspective of the treaties, of the Treaty on the European Union, how feasible options are there for integrated civilian and military CSDP missions? Very easy one, right, Ramses?
Yes, I know, Monica. That's an interesting question by Wille. Indeed, the treaty as such, and that's the easy part, the treaty as such does not really make a difference between the procedures to establish a civilian mission or a military mission. Both options are mentioned in the treaty, so the Union can establish both military missions and civilian missions. But the legal procedure to establish a mission is exactly the same. So combinations are possible, and in fact, if you very carefully look at the composition, sometimes even at the objectives and the briefs of the missions, you see that they are combined. And if you look at the composition of the staff that is used for those missions, you easily see a combination of military personnel and some advisors on civilian rebuilding rule of law type of things in a certain mission. So both in practice and in theory, this would be something to do. The question, of course, is where the question comes from. So whether this would be an interesting thing to develop further, I think it would, because it offers the European Union a tool to be engaged in different parts of rebuilding a post-conflict situation or something. So I can probably see where the question comes from.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to briefly come back to Kolja, because I had the feeling that I kind of interrupted you, and I would like to hear your opinion a bit more on the strategic compass, since you have published extensively on strategizing in general, and I will be interested in your take on on the, let's say, on the process itself, but also on the logics behind the strategic compass. So what do you make of this?
Thank you very much, Monica. If we look at the process, I think we can share the skepticism that Bastian was referring to, and basically not expecting too much. But at the same time, since the process has started, and since we know that it will be ongoing until 2022, we should probably take it also seriously, and also seriously scrutinize it, and also from our academic perspective, accompany it and reflect upon what is actually going on in that exercise. So if we look at the strategic compasses, 4 major topics, these are crisis management missions, resilience, capabilities, and working with partners, right? These are the 4 dimensions that have been identified where the strategic compass would like to make a key contribution. Now, if we start with crisis management missions, I think for me, and it will be important that these missions are developed in a joined up way, that we have missions that are obviously using CSDP tools, be it civilian tools or military tools, but that they never come exclusively only with that tool set, but are always also combined and jointly developed with the other tools that we all talked about already, are available around the table. And that also means to look into the long-term perspective. It's one thing to actually go into the theater, but you also have to come out of the theater. So the question is, how do you actually contribute to conflicts over the duration of the crisis management mission, but also beyond, right? So you need to have basically good access strategies, and you need to think about how you can sustainably follow up. Because the next point in the compass is resilience, right? That's where we all want to go to. We want to make societies more resilient, our own societies, but also those of others. We would like to help and assist. And that's what the global strategy was about, right? resilience at home in the aftermath of terrorist attacks, but also bringing resilience towards others without, obviously putting the European Union on the map as, so to speak, a refashioned colonial power. That was not the ambition, but the ambition was to assist. The question then is, how do you do that? If I can only tell you a little bit of my own research over the last couple of weeks with regards to the global health crisis, the pandemic, we're talking a lot about global solidarity, but we are very interested in our resilience first, right? Here in Europe. So how do we actually think about the resilience of others? So we need to take that seriously. Our own resilience and efforts to build up resilience at home should not conflict from a normative perspective, I would argue, with the resilience of others outside the European Union. If you think globally, you need to have these both in balance. That's my second point. The third point, capabilities. I think we really have to think about the UK. I think we have to think about the UK. We haven't even mentioned the UK today. I mean, how are we actually filling the gap that capabilities are no longer available so easily for the European Union that used to be within the European Union? How do we arrange this? How are we bringing the UK, so to speak, into the picture? But that's only one of the issues. And then last but not least, and I was very happy to hear that Jean-Pierre was already mentioning diplomatic power and the absence of diplomatic power Europe. Working with others, two comments. I think it's on the one hand, diplomacy for security. So the European Union has to invest in actually teaming up with others for crisis management and beyond. And the other issue is diplomacy in security. That means that you use diplomacy as a tool to actually arrive at lastable, peaceful, so to speak, objectives that you have. And there are, we talked about low-hanging fruits. We talked about untapped potentials. Well, we have a lot of special representatives in the European Union. How can we use them? How can we use them more strategically? These are my comments.
Thank you so much, Kolja. That was really a brilliant intervention from you. And unfortunately, we have to wrap up because, as you know, there is another things coming on the agenda. So at this point, I would like to thank you all for your brilliant interventions. It was a pleasure to chair the debate. It was actually a very easy task to some extent because you were all, of course, very professional and very prepared for the topic. And I just have the feeling that we opened up more questions that we actually were able to answer. But I think this is the usual thing that happens with conferences as such. But we are now in a good position to hope that the next guest on the agenda, so the High Representative, will answer all the questions that you open up for the debate. And at this point, thank you so much. Thank you also for the great questions from the participants. I didn't really have time to engage all of them, but hopefully we'll have more opportunities to meet and to discuss together. Thank you, guys.